Francesca Ekwuyasi is a writer you read with the windows open. Her work embodies what it means to be attentive to life, in spite of the fact that, as she admits in this interview, paying attention is overwhelming. Francesca's novel Butter Honey Pig Bread was one of the most critically acclaimed works of fiction in 2020. It's a book that shows the deep love that motivates Ekwuyasi's art, life, activism, and writing. She expands on why she feels drawn to stories about pleasure, joy, and reconciliation, and also why she's driven to write stories that show us how to love properly and heal, even as the world is constantly ending. She talks about the lengthy improvisational process of putting her staggering book together, how the book became so much more immersive through this process, and how she writes with the hope of understanding, or I suppose with the faith that the reader will work to understand what she's trying to communicate. She talks about intimately knowing sisterhoods and wanting to write women's experiences into the world, using the conventions of fiction to move, as she puts it, toward a merging that is also a kind of unraveling. Yeah. Well, I invited you for a number of reasons, but, I like many people, found out about your work because of the Canada Reads competition, but also just the amount of attention that the book has received. So I'm really excited now that, I've had time to really digest the book, to use a food metaphor, to talk to you about it. I mean, I don't want to spoil the book, and I don't really want to necessarily, spend this entire time trying to get you to kind of unlock all the secrets of the book. I'm really just interested to hear about the writing process. And my first question is more or less about the writing process. I recently attended a series of online lessons about writing, and hosted by Alexis Shotwell. And, one of the most interesting ideas that Shotwell gives us is this idea that one of the most helpful ways to stay motivated to write or fight against certain habits that prevent you from writing is to have like a metaphor in mind for the act of writing. You told Prism Magazine in an interview that for you, it's a pleasure to write, even when it's challenging. And, when he was championing your book for Canada Reads, Roger Mooking described you as an architect. So I guess I'm wondering, do you have a kind of metaphor for thinking, I guess, about the act of writing, a metaphor that you use to describe what you're doing when you're writing? Like, do you think of yourself as making a meal, for example? Anything like that come to mind?
I haven't really thought about it like that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
because I haven't been terribly disciplined. I've just sort of come to writing for pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I do think, I don't know where I heard this, and I think I must have said this in an interview, but uh, I can't remember where I heard it, but something about approaching your craft like a lover, or like you're having a love affair.
Mm-hmm.
And so you always kind of, the joke is that like married people who are having love affairs always can somehow find time. And I like that. I like the thought of treating my craft like a love affair. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and it preserves the pleasure of it. Like, I think, that's the whole goal. In fact, of Shotwell's advice is to try and, especially for academic writers, I think, restore some of the actual pleasure, the thing that brought you to writing. Because, like, we reach a point where it seems as though there is this ascetic ideal when it comes to writing, that it should be painful. Um, you know, in the way that maybe some people imagine food preparation should be like a labor, just purely a labor. I see interesting like echoes of your attitude toward writing in the ways that your characters think about food preparation.
Mm,
Taye suddenly decides to make food. Like, there's this improvisational quality to every moment where she decides to like make a cake or empanadas, and so I think it sounds as though what you describe as a lack of discipline in writing is really an attempt to preserve almost like the improvisational element of writing, you know?
No, I love that idea of approaching writing as improvisational
Mm,
and with love.
yeah.
Mostly because I mean the reason I say it's a pleasure is because I, since I was small, kind of escape into my imagination. I think a lot of people, if not every human being, does that. Um, and so writing is sort of the fun part of like returning to reality, is like getting to
Hmm.
transcribe what you experience. So like imagining the imagination is this like vast and new landscape, and when you recede or when you spend time in there, you just collect really cool data. Or I mean, the inverse of that is just like watching people and being attentive to life.
You've spoken to this in other places. Your kind of relationship to stories, like you told CBC Books that for you, reading is about igniting the imagination, and that
Mhm.
books as you say are about sort of providing these worlds, but also you say that books offer hope for future possibilities, and that stories are an important source of comfort in strange times. It got me thinking about the Canadian critical race theorist Catherine McKittrick,
Mhm.
who writes a lot about storytelling, uh, being heavily influenced by Sylvia Wynter,
Mhm.
who is really stressing that human beings are, of course, biological and chemical, but also as crucially, we tell stories of ourselves.
Yeah.
And McKittrick, though, in thinking through Winter's ideas, has this lovely line where she says, "The story cannot tell itself without our willingness to imagine what it cannot tell."
Yeah.
That there's this, radical open-endedness or vulnerability involved in the act of giving a story. And Kambiri Nachi, she experiences that exact thing herself, whenever she begins to think about the future.
Mhm.
And in working through Butter Honey Pig Bread, I was really struck by how often the story was actually challenging my own personal reluctance to kind of give in to the voices in your story.
Mhm.
These lavish sensory descriptions of like cutting melon on page 143, they're almost overwhelming.
Mhm.
What can books like yours, which clearly dwell very deeply in the sensuous realm,
Mhm.
teach us in a way about taking the patience to properly sink into a story rather than just looking for data? Like when I read those details, I'm reminded of McKittrick's sense that there's a lot of reciprocity involved in storytelling. It's not this one-way street.
Mhm. Oh, so everything you just said was making me think of. I mean, I think the term we use for it now is mindfulness.
Right.
But for example, sometimes when I'm outside and like completely sober, just like looking at the sky, it's kind of overwhelming just how, how vast it is, or it just paying attention, I think, is overwhelming.
Hmm.
Paying attention just on a walk, everything is kind of awesome when you look really closely.
Yeah.
And I think that's my favorite thing because most days, most moments, I'm preoccupied with like anxiety, future, past obsession.
Yeah.
But when I drop in, I'm just like, everything is really awesome. And so for me, writing is dropping in, which means quite a lot of the time it's difficult because if I have to really be present, not just to like what my body is sensing, but where my mind and my imagination want to go, it can feel overwhelming if I don't feel well or aligned. It can
Hmm.
be overwhelming to occupy the space, but it's kind of what I require it's what is required of me by what the process requires of me, and I think in turn what my writing requires of readers,
Hmm.
because I know that thing of reading through a story or even honestly a recipe book and my eyes glaze over and I'm like, ugh, once the words change to like numbers just to indicate like an amount, like a cup full or a quarter cup full, my mind just resents that so much. And so the practice of actually forcing myself to read a full recipe or a full sentence and envision it and like be so present to it, yeah, it becomes a requirement. And
Hmm.
I think I've kind of forced that on readers who are going to enjoy my work.
Yeah, I was gonna ask about that. The ways in which the structure of your book does seem to force readers into a different kind of rhythm
Mhm,
that is about, as you say, paying attention
mhm,
and allowing oneself to be overwhelmed by the
mhm,
scale, the immensity, the complexity, the sublimity of things.
mhm,
There's a certain art to noticing those things that
mhm,
your book demonstrates, but also, like I say, in the actual structure of the book, it's like embodied. There's so much switching of tenses in the book,
mhm,
switching of pronoun use and perspectives throughout without any signposting to the reader. As you say, you're kind of forcing the reader to do this reciprocal work.
mhm,
And I felt like there were the only signposts in the book were like two words that you give the reader: um, intense and
mhm,
negotiating. There's this moment where Taye says in a letter, intense is a good word, and then negotiating it as well as like underlined as a really important verb.
mhm,
And I think in both cases, like you're kind of like giving the reader the code for how to sink into the text. Like it is meant to be intense, and it is
mhm,
a constant kind of negotiation.
mhm,
And I guess I wondered how you developed the structure. I know you wrote the book over a number of years,
mhm,
so obviously the experiments that you're playing with came into form slowly. Um, but ultimately, the effect is that the reader can't easily determine the order of events in the book
mhm, mhm.
or effortlessly synthesize the sense data in it. Um, and I guess, to put it in a question, was that decision on your part about like just deliberately defying the reader's expectations? Were you trying to leave room for your own improvisation during the writing process? Or was it about trying to make these really subtle, sumptuous juxtapositions in the book that couldn't be, that you couldn't produce in a linear way?
Mhm. Well, first, I want to thank you for like just your reading of this work.
Thanks for
um,
writing it. Oh my
I,
gosh.
I really appreciate it. Um, and yes, I was experimenting and I wanted to leave room for improvisation.
Hmm.
I wanted to, because I didn't know, I didn't have a clear picture. I don't always when I write, I don't always have like I don't know what will happen.
Sure.
Especially with this book, and I'm working on something else now where I'm trying to know what will happen so I can plan because you know capitalism requires production. And I'm like, oh God. But yes, I wanted to leave room for improvisation, and I don't know really. I think a lot of what I'd been reading since childhood gave me permission to play.
Hmm.
Um, and like, I suppose my only goal ultimately, like with any story, is that you know that you see what I'm saying.
Sure.
That you can see what I'm trying to say. So, like, whatever language experiments, whatever illustrations I need to make, however much I'll play and just take risks, as long as like a reader will read it and get it. you know,
Yeah.
the point is never to be opaque, or I don't know the word.
Inscrutable. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
no. The point is actually to make you feel it as much as possible, like feel
Hmm.
it in your body as well. Um,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
I think the time worked to my favor. Um, the time to just experiment and play. Um, and I think that I mean I hope for more of that room in my life.
Yeah, and it's an interesting kind of fine line that you have to find between that level of experimentation that produces a more challenging experience than just something that is going to be like generic and conventional, while also maintaining some degree of like coherence, you know?
Mhm.
And I kind of see a connection there to the exposure that you got through Canada Reads and
Mhm.
being listed, for a number of literary prizes. Like what Canada Reads seems to suggest is that there's, room for books like yours to be read widely. And Danelle Cito talks about how like these mass reading events like Canada Reads or like Oprah's book club are really good for encouraging reading, but they don't always encourage the reading of challenging, potentially life-changing texts.
Right.
And I guess, like, do you feel as though these mass reading events like Canada Reads are different in some sense? Like, they're not purely populist reading competitions. They're not like American Idol for books. They are curated, and people put a great deal of thought into sort of defending these books. But I don't know, what kind of value do you see in this format?
Yeah.
And what do you see as like the potential, maybe, I don't know, problems with that kind of promotional uh, approach?
So prior to being on Canada Reads, I didn't actually know how it worked, but I found out that the champions, they pick the book. They pick, and I think they can pick up to like a decade or more or less a decade prior. So any book that was released within the last 10 years. Um, and so it really comes down to taste and also what the champion would be aware of, like what books they might be aware of, right?
Right.
And even language in many ways, because um, I don't know, I haven't followed Canada Reads for a long time, but I don't know if there's any francophone books or if there's like a separate one. So I think there are all these like limitations. Um, but I think knowing that the champions get to pick whatever book they'd like to defend, that was really exciting to me because it just made me that much more grateful for the fact that Roger like genuinely liked my book.
Hmm. Clearly.
Um, and like they do a lot like those sorts of you know mass reading events
Hmm.
do a lot for promotion. I think my book might not necessarily have been a type of book that certain people would just on a whim pick up based on the cover, based on the title. But
Hmm.
because of Canada Reads, because people just couldn't stop hearing about it,
Hmm.
um, it informed, I believe it like made a wider range of people more
Hmm.
interested, and half the time just getting people to read your work is a thing because people hear the themes or they hear the synopsis, and you know even like even a plot summary of a book, it doesn't really tell you what your experience of the book will be like because it's not just about the story, it's about how it's written. Anyway, all that to say, I had a great experience.
Sure. And I also think, yeah, you had a great experience. I love that. You can go on YouTube and pull up a video of you speaking to Roger about the book. Like, it isn't just about the author functioning almost like a just a commodity. Like
Yeah.
Oprah's book club occasionally felt like that, right? Like
Mm,
Oprah had kind of positioned herself as a like kingmaker in the publishing industry,
mm,
and so the revealing of any book, it was primarily commercial. Whereas
mhm.
Canada Reads, it feels like it more explicitly cultural, right? It's about someone
Right.
speaking to how this story is potentially transformative, like in specific ways, and I think Butter Honey Pig Bread is a book that certainly deserves wide readership, but I think like it's a book that really deserves to reach really diverse publics too, like people
Mm,
in a lot of different spaces, not just academic or literary, but I think
mhm,
popular as well,
mhm.
um,
Thank
because
you.
yeah, like and because it is such a invigorating, visceral sort of story, and because too it's about um, people finding not just themselves, but which just feels like a cliche, finding themselves, but finding that they fail to find themselves, right? And that
Mhm.
through a degree of failure, they kind of learn how to problematize basically
Mhm.
certain ways of being in the world
Mhm.
as female, male. The tension around body size in the text is
Mm.
palpable too, you
Yeah.
know, and I certainly want to come back to that. Um, but I guess I did want to zoom out and take another look at the question of storytelling in relationship to history more broadly, and not just one history, but the history of colonialism in particular, um,
Mm.
and within the Black diaspora. Raoul Peck has this sprawling new HBO documentary series called "Exterminate All the Brutes," which is an attempt to very poetically capture the history of colonization. Um,
Mm.
and at one point, Peck, a Haitian director, speaks to the stories that we tell about human history, and he says human beings participate in history both as actors and as narrators. Um,
Mhm.
those who seek history with an upbeat ending, redemption, reconciliation, may search in vain.
Mm.
Um, and so Peck throughout this documentary is sort of invested in what Frank Wilderson calls, like, I guess, Afro pessimism, right?
Mhm.
Um, and that is not your dominant mode of like storytelling. But I wonder to what extent you've read Afua Cooper's work. Who at one point was Nova Scotia's poet laureate. Uh,
Yeah.
Her book Black Matters, her book of poetry, really spoke to me as a kind of like companion to your book, right?
Mm.
The end of that book is this poetic reflection on the ways that music especially
Mm.
uh, captures the vitality of the Black experience. There's this poem called Congo Songs by the Rivers of Babylon, where she
Mm.
says, we will not sing songs of grief and exile, but
Mm.
songs of strength and sunshine, songs of the certainty of us living.
Mm.
And like that refusal is to me what marks Butter Honey Pig Bread. And I guess to make it into a coherent question, I wanted to specifically ask about the investment in music in the text,
Mm.
right? You describe dancing as a kind of sensual inquiry. This idea that we're kind of discovering each other. Music is such a central thing to Taye's appreciation of life.
Mhm.
um, I wondered if you could speak to the effect that you think communicating this relationship to music has, for our like relationship to that character, if that makes
Mm.
sense.
Yes, yes. I'm a fan of Afro Cooper. Um, I want to say professor.
Right.
um, but yes, I'm a huge fan, and joy is a big theme in basically well, I want joy to be central to everything I do.
Mm-hmm.
And I again, I don't think that's innovative. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's what I grew up seeing. So like, I grew up in Lagos, and it genuinely is like a city of contradictions.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just like so much immense like poverty right next to some incredible like just over the top wealth, and
Right.
like lots of extremes in that way. So like seeing suffering
Mm-hmm.
daily alongside celebration
Mm-hmm.
daily. It's just, yeah, it's what I know. It's what I know. A lot of Africans, I mean, I'll go as far as to say Africans. I can't speak for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
But as an African person, it's what I know as a Nigerian person, and as a Black person, and but it doesn't end there really, because I'm part of a community here where, you know when we get like awful news or like intense awful things happen, we cook together,
Mm-hmm.
and we find a way to have a laugh. It's just genuinely, and so I suppose like the inclusion of celebration, of joy, and of music in this way, it wasn't. it wasn't intentional. It just seemed obvious, in writing about
Mhm.
a character like Tae in the communities that she found herself in. But even for Cambria, um, they were dropped. Both of those characters, I think, were dropped into like their senses. Even though Cambria was very much straddling like the spiritual and physical realm. In her time being in the physical realm, like she was like dropped into her senses, and so music is a great way to, well, food and music actually, I
Yeah.
think are great ways to like incite that in the reader, because I imagine most people can relate to that, even people who struggle with like food.
Mhm.
Everyone can relate to like hopefully what it feels like to have a meal or to share a meal with somebody you like, or to be reminded of a moment by hearing a song or a smell. So it really was a rather unintentional tool to like, yeah, connect readers to like the sensual.
Mhm.
Um, and music also works as like a marker of time. So I was very interested. I mean, I come from a family of like artists, so
Hmm.
so and my brother's a music producer, so I learned kind of the the reason I laughed when I just said that was because nothing I'm saying is original. Like I'm just imagining my brother listening to this and being like, "Yeah, I told you that." Um,
Sure. But, it may not be original or, unique to the experience of growing up in Nigeria to be submerged in so much music,
yeah,
but it does feel as though you're trying to stress in the book that, like, there are, as you say, music is kind of a time machine, and there are groups like, the Lijadu sisters,
yeah,
that speak to the characters in a really profound way, and in a way that gives us access to a particular time and place, which I think is the thing about music, and obviously to some extent about food. You can return to an experience of joy through that object. Um, so one of the things I wanted to ask about is, you mentioned in an interview that you're drawing on your own experiences in the book, but especially because in it you are, quote, just writing about women,
mm,
which I thought was like such a interesting kind of blunt statement. Um, why was it necessary for you to write about women, or inescapable for you to write about women? At one point in the book, Patricia Hill Collins' Black Feminist Thought is mentioned,
mhm,
which is a book that talks about how important, a political and social impact it would have to, have more women act as, socially, a centering force,
mhm,
rather than fetishizing political leaders or
mhm.
spokesmen or something. Uh, Hill Collins talks about center women, women that center us. Was part of the purpose in writing your book to create a space to celebrate women, to celebrate like all the kin keeping and care labor that they do, or did you have other goals in mind?
Well, so I really didn't have goals in mind, but
Right.
I think what happened was I essentially was writing what I knew, and
Hmm.
just I was raised by my grandparents, but my grandfather died when I was 10, and my grandmother's still alive, so she was, central to my caretaking, and my aunties really. And so I just really was raised by women.
Hmm.
And I went to an all girls school, um and so I just felt more interested in writing about women, but also more experienced with knowing women, with knowing sisterhoods in different ways. Um, and of course, I have brothers, and I love them, and I love the men in my life. They're lovely, um, but I don't have the same kind of confidence in writing a male character, which is not to say that people have to write from this way, but for this particular book, and at the time I started writing and up until the time I finished, I was very interested in just how these women would live their lives.
Hmm.
And the truth is, with our understanding of gender, particularly and either of the twins could have been, they could have, one of them could have been like not a woman, could have been like a gender fluid person or a non-binary person. Genetically, though, they needed to be identical, like physically, just as part of the story.
Hmm.
Um, other other than that, I just was interested in writing about women, and because there were two like kind of, you know, one-dimensional bad men characters. I was interested in like having the other men that ended up being like central to the story. I wanted them to be just like generally good, like complicated and nuanced, but ultimately like not evil.
Hmm.
Because there were two just straight up evil, no nuance, no context characters.
Hmm.
Um, but ultimately, yeah, it's a story about relationships between these women as sisters and as daughters and mother, um, and also some of the friendships there, right? So Isabella and the romantic relationships as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And like I appreciate what you say about the male characters in the book. Like I was really struck by the moment where Taye comes out to Bobby. Spoiler
Mm.
alert. Because I kind of anticipated there to be some degree of hostility. And
Mm.
that's not how you wrote that character. And there was something reassuring, I guess, about that. But the thing about the book is that it is certainly about relationships between women, but relationships that are made complicated, made difficult,
Mhm.
that don't become by virtue of any sort of natural reason difficult, but instead are made hard by life.
Mhm.
Like there's a point where Kambiranachi realizes that it seems as though it's her realization that her mother has been made hard by life, and
Mhm.
she thinks the same thing about her own, and you don't diagnose it, her own madness, that
Mm.
she is made mad by life. um,
Mm.
and this is throughout the book, really, this idea that when relationships fail, between women who are trying to keep kin, it is often because of these external pressures, patriarchy,
Mhm.
capitalism, whatever it may be.
Mhm.
And that is just like happening subtly in the book. And I guess I wondered, like one of the major ways that that seems to play out in the book is through Taye's Our Lady figure.
Mhm.
And I guess, I wanted to ask, like, does this idea of having an apparition friend need to be seen as like more understandable to people? Like this is something that
Mhm.
Taye uses to help her through loneliness and grief. And
Mhm.
for me, it reminds us of what Judith Butler calls the fundamental sociality of embodied life. But what's
Mhm.
going on in the development of this relationship between Taye and her imagined companion? Is it a composite of all of these women in her life, or what is it? I said I wasn't going to ask you to decode any secrets, and then I straight up did. This is again a limitation that I have as a fiction reader, I think, right? Like I'm trying to decipher it. I'm trying to make that the appearance of Our Lady cohere.
I love I really loved writing Our Lady because my grandfather was very devoutly Catholic, and
Mm,
I remember him traveling to see apparitions,
hmm.
and I didn't know, because I was a child, I didn't know that was like a sort of global phenomenon
Hmm.
where people would like go in pilgrimages to see where there was allegedly an apparition of the Virgin Mary, or people would see like images of the Virgin Mary on toast, or things like that.
Hmm.
And so I just think that's fascinating, and it comes back, I think, to my understanding of how we as humans, we just tell stories to make sense of what's happening, like
Hmm.
just to make sense of like existential feelings. I think we created God. We started telling stories about God in different, across the globe, different communities, different cultures throughout history just have a story about God.
Hmm.
And And I think that's just, we tell stories. That's what we do. I think that's one of the fundamentally human things
Hmm.
that maybe makes us all, other than being embodied and, I don't know,
Hmm.
having red blood, makes us all the same.
Hmm.
And so I love writing Our Lady because really what we're doing when we see apparitions, whether or not we see them, it doesn't matter. Like whether or not it's actually a spiritual phenomenon or I'm imagining it because I need to, my experience of it is the same. I'm seeing this thing. And I wanted to gift that to this character who is just incredibly lonely. Um, yeah, and Our Lady really is not. I didn't write her to be like a stand in for any of the women missing in Ty's life.
Hmm.
I genuinely wrote her as this apparition that Ty may or may not be imagining.
Hmm.
It may or may not be happening just objectively, but it doesn't really matter to the story because it's what this character needs to propel her story forward.
Yeah, no, it gives me some insight into the kind of, I guess, literary function of Our Lady in the book, and throwing us in the middle of this experience that Taye herself is having of trying to process the grief. I think I thought it worked really well. Like and fits with the character. I mean, drugs are a significant part of Taye's maturation. Like it should be said.
Yeah.
It's throughout the entire book, and I haven't seen much discussion of that in the press around the book, and I wonder to what extent
Hmm.
that just speaks to a still existent taboo around using drugs, even in a
Yeah.
country that has legalized cannabis. You know, it's difficult to talk about how that drug affects you, and it's
Hmm.
in the book it plays out in interesting ways in terms of the connection between Taye and Kehinde. There
Hmm.
are moments where Kehinde is so eloquent, so where words are flowing freely for her, and she doesn't clearly need the help of drugs to give an account of her experience. She seems to have a unique access to like unmediated self-expression. Um,
Hmm.
and so that interplay is so interesting, like throughout the book. And again, to ask you, I guess, about how you as the architect of this book, how you structured it. um, I wonder how you came up with the system that you use for just titling chapters, by citing either, it sounds like, who is speaking or whose perspective is kind of orienting the chapter. um, how did
Yeah.
you come up with that, first of all?
Oh my goodness, I read so many books like that growing up.
Right.
Like so many like young adult books, or I don't know if Sweet Valley High does that. Maybe a Babysitters Club. I'm not sure.
See, I just am not I'm not as much of a reader of fiction, I guess. But like, and so I
Yeah.
was like reading more into it than perhaps I should
Mhm.
have. Like at the end of the book, for example, there's a chapter that's titled Taye, and yet Gende's voice is central to that chapter. And then in the next section, Taye's voice takes over, and yet it's named after Kinde. And I wondered, like again, reading into it, whether that was about their specific connection or about how we're actually, as people, we are constantly created constantly, every day, as it were, for another, right? In this case, for our
Mhm.
sister. Were
Yeah.
you playing with that conceptually at the end of the book?
Yes, yes, in a way because things were kind of unraveling.
Right.
Um
There's a lot of momentum at the end of the book. Yeah.
yeah, and there was a part where, it was I don't know, I think it must have been Kande's section, but then she was talking about Taye's story. She was talking about what Taye was telling her.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that because food and kind of the sharing of secrets eventually, and maybe not secrets, but just the small gifts of what they were thinking
Hmm.
were the only, because most of everything that happened was in the past, and so in the present, those moments where Taye and Kane are talking,
Hmm.
I just wanted to um, kind of start to merge them a little bit because so
Yeah.
much of what so much of what the book is about is their separation.
Yeah,
Uh,
that really communicates on a number of different levels, I think, at the end of the text. Um, that's the sense that you get, right? And it's happening really subtly at the actual like texture of the text, which is interesting. Um, I had some more questions actually about, I wanted to ask you about your relationship to Halifax now at the current moment. But I mentioned my reading of Kehinde's voice in the text, and the other thing I wanted to ask about was Kehinde's body. Right? She talks a lot about her body, and as like an academic who's written a lot on fat studies and body diversity in terms of like um, you know um, this contemporary obsession, it seems, with like the obesity epidemic. I'm really interested in texts like Butter Honey Pig Bread that are actively trying to provide, I think, an antidote to certain like normative conceptions of like what constitutes a healthy or sexy body. I mean, like, Charmaine Nelson, who you may know as Canada Research Chair in Transatlantic Black Diasporic Art at NASCAD.
yes.
She writes about this in relationship to the history of art and pop
Hmm.
culture. That
Hmm.
valorizing the black body and experience for her is about like the ability to project an image of the body and have it confirmed outside of oneself.
Hmm.
And she's also arguing that racism uh, basically normalizes a certain like hypersexualized version of black femininity that actually
Hmm.
ironically denies sexual agency.
Hmm.
I was thinking about all of this stuff when I was reading your book, but also looking at some of the art that you've done. Do you feel as though Kahinde's internalized fat phobia is something that by the end of the text she's sort of worked through to some extent, like that she's developed a degree of self love by the end of the text, or is that process ongoing for her?
Well, yeah, like I think it's ongoing for her because I think it's ongoing for I think anyone with a body.
Yeah.
Like this fat phobia is like such a only in recent years have we been acknowledging that it's not actually a sin to be fat,
Hmm.
and actually maybe it's really messed up the way that fat people are dehumanized
Hmm.
in media and in the medical, only in the last few years, anyway, at least only the last few years have I been aware of it, is what I should say. Because growing up, even on the continent, even in, in a country where like big bodies are very normal and very valued, it's there was still all that fat phobia. It's so bizarre, and it's very bizarre.
Yeah.
Um, but yes, I think it's ongoing for this character, because she never reached a point of, she struggled with her embodiment,
Hmm.
initially because of this traumatic experience. And I think for many people who've been through, whether in childhood or in adulthood, like when you experience a sort of body violation, it just manifests in different ways.
Hmm.
And I think for this character, it manifested in like incredible self-loathing around her body, as well as an eating disorder, and which is more implied. It's not explicit.
That's right. Yeah.
Um, but again, this is what I witnessed in others. What I witnessed by just like being alive and being a woman.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I also wanted to, because I know so many people who have this experience and who also still seek pleasure.
Hmm.
I didn't want to, as much as I wanted to stay away from stereotypes, and I think particularly around like African literature, some stereotypes around like um, poverty porn or like trauma porn, or like hardship, having characters go through hardship, having Black women go through hardship. Um, I wanted to, I didn't want to replicate anything that would feed into those narratives, but I also didn't want to limit the experiences of my characters out of fear. So I wanted the queer character to be a hedonist who likes sex, who is free, and in this way that some people perceive that kind of freedom as immoral. Um, and I also wanted this character, Kehinde, who had experienced this horrible traumatic thing and still going through very real responses to a traumatic thing, to also want love and a family. And even though she goes through depression, she still wants to, like the world is kind of always ending. And here we are still trying to be pretty.
Hmm.
And by pretty, I mean like make beautiful
Hmm.
things, make beautiful music, and, you know, fall in love. And have like imaginative sex, that's beyond the purpose of reproduction.
Right.
Um, and yeah, so I suppose I wanted to illustrate that. I wanted to illustrate like the fucked up, intense, horrible stereotype making things, um, as well as like a reality of like lushness and abundance.
Yeah, and again, it's embodied in the text. The text is a living, testament, I think, to that goal. A certain willful vitality that you also communicate on your Instagram. This. I was really inspired by a post that you made recently about just investing in soft things in a hard world.
Mm,
That I think that comes through in Gende's envy for the self-love of fat women who, as she puts it, drape their luscious curves without embarrassment.
mhm,
She wants to love herself, and
mhm,
loves those who do. I think it unfolds so subtly, right? The fact that, as you say, Kihinde is constantly drawing this one photo over and over again, and the
mhm,
reader is left to decipher, like, what is it about this particular photo, and her desire to circumscribe the limits of her body, to find the limits
mm,
of her body.
mm,
It does feel as though the character finds herself to some version of self-love by the end of the book.
mhm,
I thought, especially because she asserts that she is being treated unfairly at the airport. Like, there's this moment where she makes it clear that this behavior is discriminatory, it's racist, and she names it as such.
mhm,
And that seems like a really significant moment too in the book. Like, and it got me thinking again about Charmaine Nelson's, writing on racism. She has this brilliant introduction to a book called Racism A, which is about racism in Canada, where she says, like, in Canada, those that are victimized by racism are often not assumed to be sufficiently credible to talk about their own experiences in an objective way.
mm, mhm,
And it feels like Kehinde by the end of the book has really like developed a sense of how to, like, authoritatively describe her social reality, which she just didn't have before.
mhm,
And I guess I was hoping you could tease out some of these moments in the book where you do talk about white supremacy. Like, there's this moment where Farouk is described as skyping Taye and ranting about the fucked up way that white supremacy slips a chip on your shoulder.
mhm,
These moments are just dropped in, but it's not like heavy handed necessarily. How did you balance, I guess, politics with storytelling? Maybe is one way of asking the question.
mm. Yeah, well, yeah, I have to give so much credit to my editor, because some of those characters are politically engaged. Farouk, for example, even though we don't hear from him directly. Salome as well.
Hmm.
Some people in Ty's life, yeah, they are politically engaged people who would be using that sort of language, who would be talking about those things. But the reality is, like, no one, when I meet people who, or even I myself as perhaps somebody who would be using that sort of language, I mean, I still have to like just have chips and like play with a kid in my life, you know, like
Mm-hmm.
it's and I wanted the book to really um kind of illustrate a fullness, or like a three-dimensional or 360 view of what a life can be, which is not always righteous, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But I just understood that readers would understand, and that, you know, like hearing the term white supremacy wouldn't be alienating, and they would hear it and recognize, and they would recognize, you know, for example, you know, what could have been contributing to Kande's incredible depression, like winter, you know, experiencing winter, extreme, no, Quebecois winter for the first time as a black person from the African continent. You know, I think there's just some um, a lot of room for understanding, or room hoping for understanding. I'm hoping that readers will meet the characters and kind of understand that growing up maybe in France. And I, you know, and again, a lot of this perhaps is the privilege of being able to learn certain things. I know that, you know, people from the Maghreb in are not having a great time in France in terms of racism, you know. Like what the kind of racism that North Africans or like Arab people from the African continent face in France is extreme. And so this character saying that, considering how I've described his features and complexion, I imagine people understand or will take the time to understand. So in many ways, this is not a exactly what you said. It's definitely not a quick book,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm actually asking people to like research a bit. You know, some of my favorite books have given me the chance to learn in that way. Like I always think about The Brief and Wonderful Life of Oscar Wilde. I think that's what it's called, by Juno Diaz,
Mm.
and how much learning I learned so much about Puerto Rican history. I learned so much about like so many Spanish words, because I would go get to a place and be like, oh, I don't know what this is. I should look it up.
Mm-hmm.
Which maybe some people don't like, and that's okay. But I like that.
Well, you know, those folks will become literary scholars and provide the footnotes for future editions of your book, you know? There and there are numerous places where I was mentally providing those footnotes, you know, like the oh my gosh, the way that you talk about the glaring scars of gentrification in North End Halifax. You know,
Right.
you're
So people,
yeah,
Pelargonians know that. You know, people who grew up here know that.
you know, I have firsthand experience of that area and how, as you know, you're joking, there's this like comedic tone in that section of the book, but you're saying like gentrification and its scars have to be ignored in order to appreciate buzzworthy spaces, you
Oh
know,
yeah.
fancy food and drink, that kind of thing.
Oh,
um
absolutely.
you know, and that's all kind of just dropped in the text, right? Like, don't ask where the black and indigenous people are. Like, you literally end a chapter by saying that. um you know, and I mean, like, the discussion of gentrification is deeply historical, but also,
Mhm.
like, I think emotional in the book,
Mhm.
right? Like, you talk about the twins attachment to their house in Lagos.
Mhm.
um and you talk about Lagos as this beast of a city, that, you know, you can't live anywhere and be entirely in a bubble and just
Mhm.
ignore the teeming life all around you. And I connected it to this film, The Last Black Man in San Francisco. Have you ever seen?
Mm. No, but I've heard of it. Should I watch it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
It's a, you know, gorgeous film. You know, it is about a young black man trying to reclaim his childhood home, which is this expensive kind of Victorian house in a gentrified neighborhood in San
Mm.
Francisco, and he claims to be, you know, in a mythic way, the last black man in San Francisco. Like, we're,
Mm.
you know, various forms of basically real estate discrimination,
Mm.
racial capitalism is disappearing those that have a claim
Mm.
to these neighborhoods. And it seemed to me like you were playing with the same sorts of feelings when you and histories when you describe Africville, right? There's a moment
Mhm.
toward the end of the book where Taye writes a letter about Africville that turns into this fantastical expression of a desire for everyone to be well, to have a home, and to restore their relationships with one another.
Mhm.
And I mean, like, ultimately, the book functions at times like a prophecy for a future care society, a society
Mhm.
oriented around care.
Mhm.
And so, I certainly don't want to spoil the ending of the book, but it does end with this resolute tone of hope, of being driven to find the felt experience of freedom and connection.
Mhm.
There's this sense that maybe the world does bend toward justice. Was this your dream, your vision, or please tell me it was your prophecy? Or who do you hope or think this book could potentially heal?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an emotional book, and I'm
Hmm.
definitely an emotional writer because I'm an emotional person, and I mean, there's so much. The whole entire book is based on this like perceived betrayal, this
Hmm.
painful thing, and the whole thing is about building to reconciliation, right? Building to meeting each other again.
Hmm.
And I mean, I hope for that. The news is unbearable these days, and I don't know again if it's these days or
Hmm.
all the days, and I'm just now in the last 2 years because we've been in lockdown just now, like tapping in. But it's just
It feels like things are, yeah, accelerating
yeah,
toward a critical moment. Yeah.
it really does, and it's I just maybe this is what happens when you grow up watching TV
Hmm.
and movies, but I just know this movie ends well, you
Yeah.
know. It
I
has
hope you're right.
to, because otherwise maybe we should all just stop having babies right now.
Yeah. It feels that way, and there is that level of climate anxiety in
Mhm.
particular.
Mhm.
There is a moment, in fact, where you say perhaps it's God's wrath that comes down in harsh rays to burn us now. And without being didactic, you are, I think, identifying this, the IPCC's current code red for humanity, right?
Mhm.
And this
Mhm.
thing that's kind of in the back of our minds all the time,
Mhm.
and subtending the pleasure that we still seek every day. um,
Mhm.
and it's interesting that you describe it like a movie, because I posed it to Judith Butler in these terms, right? Like, Judith Butler has this kind of emancipatory politics of nonviolence, where she admits it is completely utopian to imagine that a society like ours could potentially be nonviolent. But it's precisely for that reason that we need to believe in it. It's the impossible. I mean, she actually disagreed with this reading that I did of her book. That it's like the impossible Hollywood ending to this
Mhm.
horrific race to the bottom.
Yeah.
But yeah, I appreciate the kind of the willful hope in the book.
I don't know where I heard this. I don't know. I have to cite my sources. So after this, I'm going to research this and email you. But I read somewhere that hope is a practice or
Yes.
something of like that. And I really think that, like, I'm doing a lot of reading, like mental health reading, right? And what I'm learning right now is that we have a story and we live out that story. We have narratives about ourselves, about how we're perceived, about what things mean. Essentially, everything is neutral, and then we give it meaning based on this narrative,
Hmm.
is what I'm learning, which is like so terrifying
Yeah.
because that's too much power. I'm
Sure.
just like, no, what? How am I in
Yeah.
charge of this? Like, I can't be in charge of telling the story of my own life, but
Hmm.
precisely I am. And
Hmm.
again, I don't say this ignoring like structural realities of like poverty and racism and like
Hmm.
ableism,
Right.
right? Um, but I'm saying this sort of within that understanding that we external things ruin our lives,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. Yeah.
majority is like we give things meaning, and I think that we can learn anything. We can learn anything. We can be reprogrammed to be nonviolent and to be hopeful. And of course, it's unethical to experiment in human beings, so we can't ever know if any research that's happening around civil or peaceful societies. You know, any research happening on human beings about creating
Mm-hmm.
peaceful societies.
Mm.
But I do think that stories are kind of what shape our culture, and I don't know. I just want more stories where everything isn't miserable, and queer people aren't just like, you know, shameful and miserable and dying, and black women aren't just like the bottom of the barrel treated nonsense, and fat people aren't
Yeah.
just a world where like maybe we make up, and maybe like we learn how to love properly, and we have chances to learn and to make mistakes, and we're not abandoned. Because I don't know, those are the stories I'm looking for to give me hope. And those are the stories I want to live out. I want to live that. I want to live a life where, like, if I make a mistake or if me and somebody hurt each other, we can heal back together.
Yeah.
And a lot of, as we just said, a lot of the news is not telling us that now. It's telling us really we should all be afraid and panicked and hiding in caves and stocking up on toilet paper. So I don't want that.
Yeah. That it's too late. These ideas around like this kind of defeatist notion that it's either the situation is too complex or it's too far gone. We can tell a different story. And in telling a different story, empower ourselves, I think, collectively to heal.
Yeah, because we're not extinct yet.
Right. And those in the global south especially who are suffering under quote God's wrath or
Hmm.
anthropogenic climate change,
Hmm.
they're crying out that this threat, it's not abstract,
Yeah, it's happening now.
it's happening, yeah, now. um, and so to be mobilized by that requires, and I think the idea is hope is a discipline. I think you were maybe quoting Miriam Kaba's book, We Do This Till We Free Us, potentially. It can be right. It can be. I think when especially when it forms the basis of like social bonds, right?
Hmm.
um, this is something that people experience in, you know when they're dancing, when they're experiencing live
Hmm.
music together. You're synchronized as a social body in that moment. When you share food together in an actual communal space,
Hmm.
not in a space that is partitioned by plastic barriers, which we believed were necessary, but apparently just trap COVID into these little
Oh
small areas, right? So apparently, yeah. So we're increasingly cut off from one another. We've withdrawn from life to preserve it, but now it seems like we're going to have to actually relearn a lot of these elements of like sociality and connection. And so I think especially people who are maybe progressive or radical are hoping that this might be an opportunity for us to reassess those bonds.
no. Hmm. I really appreciate talking with you, and yeah, just talking about hope really, and and things that I guess in a lot of interviews we generally steer
Hmm.
away steer away from, like politics, and I understand that however people want to approach things, I have so much value for I have so much respect for that. But yeah, like it's kind of impossible, I think, to write about people, first of all, human beings, and not write about the things that affect human beings.
I mentioned Judith Butler earlier. Butler has this idea that there's like a melancholic norm of disavowal that tells us just move past it, just get over it.
Yeah.
And Kamberi Nachi is toward the end of the book is quite adamant that that is incomplete,
Hmm.
and that she says there is no forgetting.
Yeah.
There is no forgetting or moving quickly past trauma. But what you can do, and what the book clearly advocates, is connecting, is consoling one another and allowing oneself to be consoled, being open to that kind of love. um, the moments where people are not
Yeah.
open to that kind of love, like those are the moments where they completely unravel in the text. So the message is clearly love each other. um, it's more complex than that, but that's,
No, but that's pretty much it.
it's especially in those moments that your text tries to inspire empathy. So thank you so much for writing it. It's an incredible book, and I'll be lending it to many people.
Thank you. It's definitely very much a dream come true in all the ways. I'm incredibly humbled by like just how well received it's being. It just really makes me want to keep writing, and just makes me want to tell everyone, like, write your book. Just write your weird little book. You don't know. You don't know if people will love it. You don't know if the person who needs to read it will find it. Just do it. So thank you.